What if a forgotten roadside diner could heal the hearts of people who had almost given up? What if a weary veteran, a frightened woman hiding from the world, and a loyal dog with a soldier's courage were brought together not by chance, but by something greater guiding them toward hope? This is the story of a man who believed he had nothing left, a woman who thought she would never step into the light again, and a dog whose steady heart carried them both. And it all began with one simple act of kindness that changed an entire town. May this story warm your spirit and remind you that even in the hardest seasons, light always finds its way home. Before we begin, tell me, where are you watching from? Drop your country in the comments below and subscribe. The morning sky over rural Montana spread wide and pale, as if the land were still deciding what kind of day it wished to carry. Thin ribbons of mist drifted above the highway, curling around the abandoned billboards and the lonely clusters of cottonwoods that dotted the plains. The air held the scent of dry earth and old metal, a scent that reminded Tom Walker of forward operating bases half a world away. He felt it settle into his lungs with a familiar weight as he stepped out of his aging pickup truck and stood before the place that would become his new beginning. Before him sat the roadside diner he had purchased with the last of his savings. The building sagged under its own years. The once bright roof of sheet metal was now muted with rust, its panels creaking whenever a stray wind passed. The sign above the front door hung crooked, its half-broken name stuttering between faded letters and a ghost of paint that time had washed away. Tom had seen worse structures in war-torn towns, but those had at least held a trace of purpose. This place looked forgotten by everyone except the wind. Max trotted out from the passenger seat and circled the truck before settling beside Tom. The German Shepherd moved with the steady discipline of a dog trained through years of military drills. His coat of black and tan shimmered in the early light, and his amber eyes scanned the horizon with an alertness that never quite faded, even after leaving the battlefield. He paused, lifted his head, and pressed his shoulder gently into Tom, as if offering silent reassurance. Tom rested a rough palm on Mac's neck. The gesture was simple, yet grounding. Max had been more than a working partner. He had been a shield, a companion, and the only constant presence during nights thick with dust and danger. Now, he was family in a world where most of the faces Tom once knew had drifted into their own lives and their own safe distances. Life after service had not gone the way he imagined. Tom had taken whatever jobs he could find, loading freight at warehouses, repairing fences for ranchers who could only pay in installments, driving old farm trucks across lonely counties. Every month, he worked until his muscles screamed, yet the weight of debt still pressed harder. The war had left him with skills that did not always translate to civilian life. But he carried on because there was nothing else to do. Carry on was what soldiers did. It was a late night in early winter when he first saw the listing for the diner. The price was shockingly low, lower than anything that seemed real. A weary man named Samuel, the previous owner, had spoken in a soft, tired voice and insisted he only wanted someone decent to take the place. Tom had not asked too many questions. He simply felt a pull toward the idea. A diner was work he understood. Cook simple meals, serve travelers, keep the lights warm in the cold hours. Maybe in that slower rhythm, he could rebuild the parts of himself that felt loose and rattling. Now, standing in front of the building, he wondered if hope made him reckless. The front windows were clouded with grime, reflecting only blurred shapes. The door frame leaned slightly to the right. A stack of unused crates was piled near the back wall, half buried in weeds. The place needed more than repairs. It needed resurrection. And that kind of work demanded time, money, and something deeper than endurance. But as Max nudged him again, Tom breathed in and let the cold air sharpen his resolve. He had rebuilt outposts with fewer materials. He had survived deserts with less comfort. A diner in Montana, no matter how broken, was a challenge that did not shoot back. That alone made it feel almost gentle. He walked toward the entrance. Each step stirred dust from the ground. Max padded ahead and sniffed at the cracked boards near the threshold, ears flicking as he listened to sounds Tom could not hear. When Tom pushed the door, it opened reluctantly, dragging across the floor with a low scrape. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of age, old grease, dust, and faint traces of coffee that had been brewed long before he arrived. Sunlight filtered through the window, grime in narrow beams, revealing floating specks that drifted like slow snowflakes. The counter stretched across the left side of the room, its chrome surface dented and dulled. The stools were mismatched, some with torn cushions, some with cracked vinyl. A row of booths lined the opposite wall, their seats faded into a tired red, the fabric split in places where years of travelers once rested. The kitchen lay behind a hinged door that swayed crookedly. Tom slipped inside and surveyed the rusted appliances. A stove with peeling enamel, a refrigerator that hummed weakly as if embarrassed to still be alive, an empty shelf that once held spices and canned goods. It was not much, but he imagined the clatter of pans, the hiss of oil, the comfort of coffee brewing on a cold morning. He imagined Max curled in a corner while he worked, content with the simple duty of watching the door. He walked through the kitchen and into the back room where Samuel had once handled paperwork. A single folding chair sat near a dusty desk. Faded calendars hung on the walls, each one marked with scribbled notes that had softened over time. The entire space carried a quiet loneliness, as though waiting for someone to speak into it again. Tom stood still for a moment, letting the silence settle around him. He thought of the years after his discharge, the disorientation that came when the structure of military life dissolved into days without command or mission, the feeling of drifting across civilian landscapes that felt too quiet and too loud all at once. He had tried to ignore the memories etched into him, yet they shaped every step he took. Maybe this diner would become the place where he could learn to breathe without waiting for danger. Max padded into the room and sat beside him. Tom crouched down and looked into the dog's steady gaze. Max had always sensed what stirred inside him. The dog lowered his head gently, pressing his forehead into Tom's hand. The gesture told Tom what no words ever had. They were still alive. They had made it this far, and they would keep moving. Tom rose and opened the back door. Outside stretched a wide field of dry grass, swaying under the reach of the wind. Mountains rose in the distance, their peaks dusted with white. A freight truck rumbled faintly somewhere on the highway. Life moved, slowly, but it moved. He walked back inside and set his pack down on the counter. He unrolled a small notebook where he kept plans, ideas, scattered thoughts that guided him through each day. He wrote carefully: replace windows, fix roof panels, clean grease traps, repair sign, buy coffee machine, open for first customer. The list felt immense, but lists were meant to be tackled one line at a time. Max wandered toward one of the booths and curled up, resting his head on his paws. Tom smiled at the sight. It was the first moment that felt like the start of something new. Fragile, uncertain, but real. He stepped outside once more and looked at the diner from a distance. The light shifted across the roof, catching flecks of rust that glimmered like embers. He imagined painting the walls, replacing the sign, washing the windows until they shone. He imagined travelers stopping to rest. He imagined a place that felt warm even in the coldest Montana morning. This was not just a diner. It was a chance to build a life not defined by war or by debt. A place where he and Max could settle their bones and allow the world to become gentle again. He drew a slow breath as the wind brushed past him. The land stretched wide, empty, full of possibility. Time moved forward, and Tom moved with it. With Max by his side, he stepped back toward the diner and closed the door behind them, ready to begin the long work of rebuilding their new home. The days that followed moved with a slow, steady rhythm as Tom began the long work of bringing the diner back to life. Each morning, he rose before the sun, brewed a pot of cheap coffee on the old stove, and planned the repairs he hoped to finish before nightfall. His hands soon grew rougher than they already were. Lines of dried paint clung to his knuckles, and small cuts appeared across his fingers where rusted metal pushed back against his efforts. The work was endless, but it was his, and the quiet determination that fueled him felt almost like breath after years spent holding it in. Max followed him everywhere. When Tom hammered new boards along the weakened exterior, Max sat nearby, ears alert, watching each truck that passed on the highway. When Tom scrubbed the floors and wiped soot from the windows, Max lay curled under a booth, rising only when he sensed someone approaching the door. The dog seemed to understand the importance of what they were building, as if the diner were a kind of shelter, not only for Tom, but for whatever remained fragile inside both of them. At first, the townspeople barely noticed the changes. A few locals drove past without slowing. Some glanced at the building with polite curiosity, then continued on their way. The diner had been closed so long that it had slipped from the habits of travelers and residents alike. Even when Tom managed to fix the sign enough that the name was no longer crooked, the parking lot remained mostly empty. Still, he opened the doors each morning. He cleaned the counter until it shone, brewed a fresh pot of coffee, and placed small handwritten menus on the tables. Most days, only one or two customers wandered in. A rancher in need of breakfast before hauling hay. A trucker looking for something warm before heading north. They thanked him quietly, but rarely stayed long. Their footsteps echoed as they left, leaving behind a stillness that settled deep into the walls. Tom reminded himself that progress came slowly. Soldiers learned patience in the field. They learned to wait through long hours when nothing seemed to change. So he kept working. He fixed the roof panel that rattled in the wind. He painted the window frames. He repaired the sink that leaked beneath the counter. He did everything with the steady resolve of someone who had known far harder battles. It was on a late afternoon, the kind where the sky stretched long and gold, that a black SUV rolled into the dusty lot. It stopped with a hiss of brakes, too smooth and too polished for the rough edges of the roadside diner. Max rose immediately, fur bristling faintly, a low sound gathering in his throat. Tom stepped out from the kitchen and wiped his hands on a rag as the driver door opened. A tall man climbed out. His suit was dark, perfectly pressed, and far too fine for the Montana back roads. His hair was neatly combed, his shoes gleamed, and his steps carried the confidence of someone used to owning whatever ground he stood upon. Tom recognized him from the sale documents. Rick Dalton, owner of several acres across the county. A developer who had bought up land along the highway with plans to turn the old stretch into a chain of modern stops. Rick surveyed the diner with a slow, sweeping gaze, as if appraising something of little value. He ignored Max, who stood firmly at Tom's side and walked forward with the kind of polished smile that rarely held kindness behind it. Tom greeted him with a simple nod. Rick returned the gesture, though his eyes never softened. He spoke calmly, with an ease that suggested he had given this speech many times. He mentioned expansion, progress, modernization of the area. He spoke of a new gas station and a motel he intended to build. He described the diner as a relic of the past that would only slow everything down. He offered to buy the land outright, promising quick payment and an escape from the burden of repairs. Tom listened without reacting. He had heard similar tones from officers who never walked the patrol routes themselves, people who made decisions from a distance and measured value in numbers rather than lives. He kept his voice steady as he declined the offer. Rick paused, surprised that anyone would refuse such money, especially a man like Tom, whose boots and clothes clearly bore the marks of hard labor. His smile tightened. He mentioned competition. He mentioned how small businesses struggled in towns like this. His words had the sharp edge of someone pressing to find a weakness. Max stepped forward, not aggressively, but with clear intent. The dog planted himself between Tom and the developer, muscles taut, eyes fixed. A low growl rumbled deep in his chest, not loud enough to threaten, but clear enough to warn. Rick took a small step back. For a moment, something flickered in his eyes, annoyance perhaps, or calculation. Then he straightened his jacket and forced a thin smile. He spoke again with careful politeness. He hinted that obstacles lay ahead, that the diner needed far more work than one man and a dog could handle. He said the county had strict codes, that inspections could be difficult. He framed every sentence with a tone that suggested help but carried only pressure. Tom thanked him for the information and repeated his refusal. There was no anger in his voice, only certainty. Rick eventually returned to his SUV. Before climbing in, he cast one final look at the diner, a look that carried a silent message, the kind of look Tom had seen exchanged between opposing commanders just before a long-drawn conflict. Then the SUV rolled away, leaving dust swirling behind it. Max remained tense until the vehicle disappeared down the road. When the sound faded, he pressed his head against Tom's leg, seeking assurance and offering it in the same breath. Tom rested a hand on his shoulder and leaned into the quiet that followed. He knew the developer's visit was not the end. People like Rick did not give up because of a single refusal. The sun dipped lower, and shadows stretched across the parking lot. Tom walked back into the diner and turned on the lights. Their warm glow pushed against the dim corners. Small changes, he thought, make a place feel alive again. Max settled on the floor near the counter, watching as Tom prepared for the few possible customers who might still appear before closing. Across the evening stillness, the diner stood with its faded paint and worn walls, yet held something steady inside it. A promise, perhaps, or resilience. Tom did not know which, but he knew he would fight for it. He had fought for less before, and somewhere deep in the walls and floorboards, the stories of whoever had passed through this place felt as though they waited for him to keep going. The morning began like many others as Tom stepped into the kitchen with Max close behind. The light outside was still pale, barely touching the horizon, and the diner felt quiet in a way that suggested the world was holding its breath. Tom had planned to repair the uneven tiles in the kitchen floor. The cracked surface had bothered him since the day he first walked through the diner, but there had always been other tasks pulling his attention. Today, the floor would finally be fixed. He set down his tools and knelt beside the worst section of tile. Max hovered nearby, ears pricked and body alert. Tom worked slowly, prying loose pieces of faded ceramic, lifting them with steady hands. The tiles crumbled easily, giving way to the older layer beneath. Dust rose in soft waves and settled along the light that came through the back window. As Tom lifted another tile, Max suddenly stepped forward, nose pressed against the corner of the floor. His muscles stiffened. A low sound rumbled deep within him. Tom watched him carefully. Max had reacted like this only a few times before, and always with reason. The dog began to scrape the floor with his paws, pushing fragments aside. His focus was sharp, as if following a scent that drifted from some place hidden far below. Tom wiped his hands on his jeans and leaned closer. There was a faint outline in the floor, a square shape beneath the tile pattern. He had not noticed it before. The edges were worn and nearly invisible, covered by years of dust and grime. Max stepped back, letting Tom study the shape. The dog gave a short bark, urgent and insistent. Carefully, Tom removed the remaining tiles around the outline. The more he uncovered, the clearer it became. A concealed hatch lay beneath. The metal handle was rusted nearly to dust, and the hinges were swallowed by age. It was something built long before he arrived, long before even the recent owners had walked these floors. Tom hesitated. A concealed space under a diner floor felt strange, but Max remained alert, tail low, and sweeping the ground slowly. The dog was not afraid. He was watching, guarding. Tom slipped his fingers under the metal ring and pulled. The hatch resisted at first, but with a firm tug it lifted, groaning softly as stale air rose from the darkness below. A narrow, wooden ladder led downward into a dim space. The smell that drifted up to meet him carried a mixture of dust, old blankets, and something faintly human, a trace of breath that did not belong to him. Max moved to the edge and waited. Tom picked up a flashlight, checked that the floor above was stable, and began his descent. The ladder creaked under his weight. Max followed with surprising grace, climbing in the way trained dogs sometimes learned without instruction. When they reached the bottom, Tom lifted the light. The room was small, barely the size of a single bedroom. The ceiling was low, and the walls were lined with shelves built from unfinished wood. Books filled most of the shelves, their spines faded and worn. A narrow bed sat against one wall, its quilt tucked neatly, though time had thinned the fabric. A small table held an oil lamp and a stack of papers. Everything was arranged with careful purpose, like someone living in a place they seldom felt safe leaving. Tom stepped forward and felt the weight of silence settle against his shoulders. Then he noticed movement near the back of the room. A figure sat curled on the edge of the bed. Max froze, ears forward, waiting for Tom to decide what came next. The woman looked up slowly. Her hair was long and tangled slightly, a soft brown that fell across her shoulders. Her face carried the pale stillness of someone who had seen very little sunlight for too long. She appeared to be in her 30s, though the shadows around her eyes hinted at years of strain. Her hands trembled slightly as she drew them close. Tom spoke gently, using a calm voice that came from years of needing to steady himself and others in tense moments. He introduced himself softly. Max stepped forward only a single pace, offering presence without threat. The woman watched the dog, her breath unsteady, but there was no fear in her gaze, only exhaustion and something that looked like relief. She told him her name was Emily Reed. Her voice was thin at first, as if unused for long stretches of days. She explained in halting words that she had lived below the diner for years, ever since the accident that took her husband and child. Her world had collapsed that day. She could not face the noise of the outside anymore. Each sound, each reminder, cracked something fragile inside her. The owner, before Tom, had found her during a storm and offered her a place to hide, a place where she could survive without facing the world that frightened her. Samuel had brought her food and supplies through a back entrance she never used herself. She read books to pass the time. She kept the room clean and quiet. She avoided the surface except when absolutely necessary. When Samuel became ill, she feared the day would come when he no longer appeared with groceries. She did not know he had sold the diner. She did not know he had passed away days later. Tom listened without interrupting. The darkness of the hutch felt heavy with the years she had spent alone, years shaped by grief that had never been eased. Max stepped closer and rested his head on the side of her bed. Emily reached out with a hesitant hand and let her fingers sink into his fur. A soft breath escaped her lips, almost a sigh. Something shifted in her posture, a fraction of trust returning. Tom sensed that forcing her out would only break her further. Instead, he assured her that she was safe, that the diner was still hers as much as his, that she did not need to rush toward a world she no longer recognized. He promised to bring her what she needed for now. He promised to keep her hidden until she chose otherwise. Max stayed close, as if sealing the promise. Emily lowered her gaze, tears forming quietly. She whispered that she had feared being discovered by someone cruel. But Tom was not cruel. She could see that. And Max, steady and calm, offered a kind of courage she had not felt in years. Tom stood in the center of the small room, the flashlight casting soft circles of light. He saw the outlines of a life half lived in silence, shaped by a tragedy far deeper than most people ever faced. And he knew, with the clarity of a soldier recognizing the next mission, that he could not abandon this place or the person who lived beneath it. Max pressed closer to Emily as she breathed slowly, trying to steady herself. In that quiet moment, the diner above seemed less lonely, less broken, as if it had been waiting for Tom to discover not only the room beneath the floor, but the life quietly flickering inside it. He told her he would check on her again soon. She nodded weakly. Max lingered a moment longer before following Tom up the ladder and into the light. Tom closed the hatch gently, a promise forming silently in his mind. This diner had brought him more than work. It had brought him someone who needed his strength, someone who had lived too long in the shadows, and he would not let those shadows claim her again. The next day carried a muted stillness as Tom stepped into the diner at dawn. The early light brushed across the counter and settled gently into the corners of the room, as if hesitant to disturb the quiet below the floor. Tom moved with slow, deliberate steps, feeling the weight of the discovery he had made the day before. Emily was still beneath the diner, living in a world shaped by loss and fear, yet held together by threads of hope she had not fully abandoned. Max followed closely, sensing the shift in Tom's thoughts with each measured breath. Tom prepared a simple breakfast and set aside a portion for Emily. Something warm might ease the tension he expected to find when he visited her again. With plate in hand, he lifted the hatch and climbed down the ladder. Max descended first, moving with the same careful confidence he had learned during missions overseas. Emily sat at the small wooden table when Tom reached the bottom. Her shoulders were drawn inward, but her eyes lifted just enough to show she had been waiting. The oil lamp cast a faint golden glow across her face, softening the lines that years of grief had etched there. When Max trotted to her side, she reached out automatically, fingers brushing through his fur. A quiet connection settled around them. Tom placed the plate gently on the table and took a step back, giving her space. She thanked him in a voice still fragile, but a little steadier than the day before. She had not spoken to anyone aside from Samuel for a long time, and her words came with the uneven rhythm of someone relearning the act of being heard. Tom asked if she had slept. She nodded faintly. She explained that she had stayed awake for hours after he left, unsure whether meeting him had been a blessing or the beginning of another fracture in her already splintered world. Max leaned into her knee again, offering an anchor that helped her say more than she expected. She spoke of the years after the accident, how she could not bear the sound of passing cars, how the brightness of the world above felt painful, how each reminder of her husband and child pressed too heavily against her heart. She had come here only to recover for a short while, never intending to stay hidden for so long. But days turned to months, and months to years. Samuel had been the only person she trusted, and she had relied on his kindness to survive in the quiet shelter below. Tom listened, absorbing each word with a patience refined through years of watching younger soldiers struggle with their own wounds. As she talked, he noticed a small wooden box on her shelf. Several papers were tucked inside. Their edges were worn, the corners soft with handling. He asked about them gently, and she hesitated before giving an answer. "They are letters," she said. "Letters I used to write." Tom felt something shift in the air. He asked if she had written them for anyone in particular. She looked down at her hands, tracing the edge of the quilt with restless fingers. "Years ago," she said, "before everything fell apart, I joined a charity group that sent handwritten messages to deployed soldiers. I wrote dozens of them, small pieces of hope to strangers who might have needed them. It made me feel like I could still offer something to the world." Tom felt his pulse deepen. He reached slowly into the pocket of his jacket. For a moment, he simply held the worn object there, unsure if he should reveal it. Then he pulled out the folded page he had carried for so many years. The edges were frayed from sand and sweat. The ink had faded, but the words remained clear to him. They had been his lifeline once, when darkness pressed too close. He placed the letter on the table. Emily stared at it, confused at first, then hesitant. She touched the corner with trembling fingers, unfolding it carefully. Her eyes moved across the page, widening as recognition washed through her. She whispered the words aloud, soft and uncertain. They spoke of courage, of holding on when the world felt too heavy, of finding a reason to stand again, even when standing hurt. It was a letter meant for a stranger who might be fighting battles both seen and unseen. At the bottom were the initials she had signed with quiet hope. E.R. Emily Reed. She looked up at Tom, with tears gathering quietly in her eyes. She asked how he had come to hold this letter. Tom answered slowly, each word shaped by memory. It reached me during a sandstorm, he said. I had lost friends that month. I felt hollow, angry, close to letting go of everything. Command passed out care packages, and that letter was inside mine. I read it again and again under the desert sky. Those words kept me standing when I did not think I could stand. They brought me home. Emily covered her mouth with her hand. Her breath shook as the truth settled over her. She had written countless letters, never knowing who received them, never knowing whether they mattered. Yet here stood the living proof that at least one had carried light into a moment that might otherwise have broken a man beyond repair. Max sensed her trembling and stepped closer. He rested his head gently on her leg, his warm weight grounding her to the present. Emily reached down and stroked his fur, tears slipping down her cheeks. She whispered that she had always hoped those letters helped someone, anyone. She had never thought one would reach the very man now standing in her hidden room. Tom felt something rise within him. A connection forged years ago now revealed itself as if destiny had been quietly guiding each of them toward this moment. He told her she had saved his life without ever knowing his name. She closed her eyes as the words reached her, and the quiet around them felt almost sacred. For the first time since he met her, Tom saw a spark of something fragile but powerful flicker behind her eyes. Not joy, not yet, but the beginning of a belief that she might not be lost forever, that she had once helped a man find his way home, and perhaps she could still help others, even if she remained fearful of the world above. Max nudged her again, gentle and patient. Emily breathed slowly and placed both hands on his neck. The dog held steady, a silent bridge connecting her to a world she once loved and might learn to face again. Tom remained still, letting the moment settle. The hidden room no longer felt like a place of escape. It felt like the beginning of a fragile reunion between past and present, between wounds and healing, between despair and quiet hope. And in that small, dim room under the diner, Tom understood that their lives had been intertwined long before their paths ever crossed. Not by sight or voice, but by a single letter carried across a battlefield, written by a woman who believed in kindness even as her own world fell apart. Now she was no longer a stranger hidden beneath the floor. She was the person who had once saved him, and he would not let her face the future alone. The sky over the Montana plains carried an uneasy stillness as Tom stepped out of the diner to breathe in the cold air. Clouds gathered in thick, dark layers on the distant horizon, the kind of clouds that signaled something heavy moving toward the land. Max paced beside him, ears twitching at the low rumble far beyond the highway. The wind brushed against the grass with a quiet warning. Inside, Tom had spent most of the morning fixing loose boards along the hallway and repairing a leaking pipe in the back room. The more he worked, the more aware he became of how fragile the diner still was. The walls groaned in the wind. The roof shook during storms. The foundation of the old building depended mostly on willpower and stubbornness. He believed he could fix it all with enough hours and enough determination. But he also knew luck was not always on his side. Around midday, a white pickup truck pulled into the lot. Max stiffened immediately. It was not Rick Dalton's SUV, but it carried the same tension. A man stepped out wearing a county badge and a heavy coat dusted with road dirt. His expression was unreadable as he approached. He introduced himself as the local building inspector. He had been sent to evaluate the property due to a report filed by a concerned resident. Tom did not need to ask who that resident was. Rick Dalton had kept his word. He had promised obstacles, and he had delivered them. The inspector walked through the diner with a clipboard in hand. He studied the beams, the wiring, the roof panels. His eyes moved with the practiced precision of someone trained to find faults even when faults tried to stay hidden. Max followed him from a distance, tail low, gaze steady. Tom answered every question calmly, though frustration simmered deep within him. When the inspection ended, the man cleared his throat and handed Tom a sheet of paper. Several items were circled: outdated wiring, weak structural support on the west wall, corroded pipes beneath the kitchen sink. The inspector spoke with the flat tone of someone delivering facts that could not be softened. Tom had a limited time to repair the issues. If he failed, the diner would be closed for safety reasons. Tom looked at the list. It was long. It would take money he did not have and hours he could barely spare. The inspector offered a brief expression of sympathy, but reminded him that rules were rules. Then he stepped back into his truck and drove away, leaving Tom in the growing wind with Max pressed against his leg. Tom tried to steady his breath. He knew this battle would come. He had seen the determination in Rick Dalton's eyes. People like Rick did not want competition. They wanted control. He folded the paper and slipped it into his pocket. The storm began to gather more quickly now. A sharp gust cut across the lot, rattling the diner sign until it clanged against its rusted bracket. Max barked once, a deep warning call. Tom stepped inside to secure the windows when he heard the first crack of thunder. Rain began to fall suddenly, harsh and slanted, as if poured from the edge of the sky. The road shimmered with water. The wind howled around the corners of the building. Then came the sound that made his heart jump. Tires skidding, a frantic horn, a choked shout swallowed by rain. Tom rushed to the door. A small pickup truck had lost traction on the slick highway and veered off the road. It slid sideways across the gravel, then came to a stop at a dangerous angle near a deep ditch beside the diner. The front wheels dangled inches from the drop. Inside, he saw a woman gripping the steering wheel, frozen in fear. Beside her was a small boy, wide-eyed and crying as the truck shifted with every gust of wind. Without hesitation, Tom sprinted across the flooded lot. Max bolted ahead of him, splashing through the water. The storm pressed against them, driving sheets of rain into their faces. The truck groaned, its tires slipping further. The woman screamed as the vehicle lurched. Tom reached the driver's side and pulled the door open. He urged the woman to climb out quickly before the truck shifted again. Her legs shook, but she moved, clinging to his arm as he guided her toward solid ground. The boy remained trapped, his small body wedged between the seat and the door. The truck tilted again, threatening to slide deeper. Tom shouted for Max. The dog understood instantly. He darted to the opposite side where the ditch was steep, and mud pulled at his paws. He squeezed under the frame of the truck, scraping his back against metal as he pushed himself into the narrow space. Rain flooded around him, but he kept moving. Tom knelt beside the open door and reached for the boy. but the child was too frightened to let go of the seat. Max crawled close enough to touch the boy's leg. He nudged him gently, then gave a soft bark. Not loud, not forceful. A steady anchor in the chaos. The boy looked down at the dog with tear-filled eyes. Max pressed his head against the boy and tugged at his pant leg just enough to guide him. The child shifted toward the edge where Tom reached in and pulled him out with both arms. The truck slid forward a few inches the moment the boy was free. Mud splashed across Tom's boots. Max scrambled out just in time, his paws slipping before finding ground. The three of them moved back from the ditch as the truck settled at a dangerous angle, but did not fall. The woman collapsed in relief, pulling her son tightly against her. Rain drenched all of them, as if the sky wished to wash the moment clean. Tom knelt beside them to make sure they were unharmed. Max stood close, tail low, ears still alert for any new danger. Within minutes, headlights appeared through the storm. A local rancher stopped and ran over to help. Word spread quickly. More cars pulled into the lot. People stepped out into the rain, shouting with worry and awe as they saw Tom and Max kneeling beside the rescued family. Someone called for an ambulance. Someone else offered blankets. The rancher kept saying that the ditch would have taken the truck for sure if Tom had not been watching. Others stared at Max, speaking quietly about the courage of a dog that had crawled under a moving vehicle. The storm began to ease as the sky shifted from black to gray. The wind softened. Rain slowed into a steady drizzle. When the ambulance arrived, the paramedics praised Tom for his quick action. The mother clung to his hands, thanking him again and again. She called him a guardian, sent at the right moment. She told Max he was a hero, and Max sat proudly, though still trembling with leftover adrenaline. By the time the family was taken to safety, half the town had gathered near the diner. Some had never spoken to Tom before. Others had barely noticed the old building since he purchased it. Now their eyes held something different: respect, gratitude, recognition. They saw a man who acted without hesitation despite his own struggles. They saw a dog with the instincts of a soldier. They saw a diner that was more than a forgotten building on a quiet road. That night, as the clouds finally parted, Tom stood outside the diner with Max beside him. The wind still held the chill of the storm, but something warm had taken root in the air. The town saw them now, truly saw them, and everything was about to change. Night settled over the Montana plains with a soft blue hush as Tom stepped through the diner, turning off the remaining lights. The storm had passed hours earlier, but its echo still lingered in puddles that glimmered under the street lamps and in the scent of damp earth carried by the wind. Max stayed close at his heels, moving with a calm steadiness that came only after a day marked by danger and relief. The rescue on the roadside had changed something, not only for the people of the town, but also for the small, fragile life hidden beneath the diner floor. Emily had heard the commotion. She had listened to the storm rage above her, and then to the frantic voices outside. Tom told her later what had happened, how he and Max had pulled a mother and her child from death. She had listened with wide eyes, her hands pressed together tightly. As he spoke, she seemed to carry two emotions at once: fear for the world above, and admiration for the courage that moved through it. That night, as Tom cleaned the last of the dishes, he heard a soft creak from the hallway. Max lifted his head and watched the doorway. Emily appeared slowly, her steps small and uncertain. She held onto the wall for balance and blinked against the light. Tom paused, but did not speak. He simply gave her space to decide her own pace. Emily stepped forward once more. The overhead lights were dim, softened to a warm amber that did not overwhelm her eyes. She breathed carefully, taking in the room with quiet wonder. "I want to help," she said in a faint voice, "if you will let me." Tom nodded gently. He handed her a towel and pointed to the dishes, still waiting for a final wipe. Her movements were nervous at first. Every sound from outside made her stiffen. Each passing car sent a ripple of tension across her shoulders. Yet Max stayed beside her, brushing against her leg whenever her breath turned shallow. His presence steadied her rhythm. Over the next few nights, she returned again. Each time she climbed up the ladder, she lingered a little longer in the light. She washed dishes. She wiped down tables. She watched Tom cook and asked quiet questions about the recipes. She moved with a fragile grace, like someone relearning the feeling of open space. It was on the fourth night that she surprised Tom. She brought up a small notebook filled with old handwriting. Inside were recipes passed down from her grandmother, simple dishes, rustic soups, breads filled with herbs, cakes that used molasses instead of sugar. She said she used to bake when she needed comfort. She said the smells had once made her house feel alive. Tom asked if she might want to try cooking again. She hesitated, fingers curling nervously around the notebook. Then she nodded. They began with a soup. The ingredients were few, but the flavors layered gently. Emily chopped vegetables with a slow, deliberate focus, guiding the knife carefully. Tom handled the stove. Max lay on the floor, watching each movement with attentive eyes. When the soup finished, it filled the air with a warmth that settled into the bones. Emily tasted it with a trembling spoon, and her eyes softened. She said it was the first time she had cooked since the accident. Tom added the dish to the menu the next morning. A simple name: hearty vegetable soup. A few hours later, a trucker came in from the highway, drawn by the smell drifting toward the parking lot. Then another. By evening, the diner had more customers than it had seen in months. People asked who made the soup. Tom simply said a friend helped him. The next night, Emily baked bread. The scent rose through the diner and escaped through the vents, carrying a memory of warmth across the cold highway. Local workers stopped by after their shifts: a mechanic, a ranch hand, a pair of road workers covered in dust. They sat in the booths and ate slowly, savoring something they had not expected to find in a forgotten roadside diner. Emily watched from the kitchen doorway, half hidden behind a shelf, heart fluttering with fear and pride. Max rested beside her, always watching the customers, but also watching her. Whenever she felt overwhelmed, she reached down and touched his fur. It reminded her she was still grounded, still safe. Word spread in town. People spoke of the diner that had once been nearly abandoned. The place run by a quiet veteran with a loyal dog. The place where the food tasted like home and where the atmosphere softened even the hardest days. Q Bin stopped by to share stories with Tom. Truck drivers parked for meals instead of passing through. Local families began to visit on weekends. The diner slowly transformed, not through paint or repairs, though those came too, but through life, through conversation, through warmth carried in every bowl of soup and every loaf of bread. It became a place where exhaustion could settle and ease, where strangers found rest and workers found company, where memories began to form again. Emily continued to climb the ladder each night. She stayed longer in the light. She moved closer to the windows. The world outside still frightened her, but it no longer felt like a monster waiting to take something away. It felt like something she might touch someday without breaking. Tom noticed the change, but never pushed her. He worked beside her quietly, allowing her to build strength in her own time. Max became her constant shadow. If her breath turned sharp, he pressed close. If her hands shook, he leaned his weight against her leg. He guided her through each moment of unease, as if trained for this task alone. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the hills, casting a soft gold across the counter, Emily stood fully in view of the dining room. Light touched her face. Voices carried gently from the booths. A child laughed somewhere near the door, and she breathed, slowly, steadily. For the first time in years, she looked not at the floor, but toward the world beyond the window. The sky stretched open before her, wide and pale. She whispered that she had forgotten how big it felt. Tom watched quietly from the kitchen. There were no grand words to offer, no speeches. Only the simple truth that healing was not a single moment, but a series of small steps taken with courage. Emily was taking them. Max was guiding her. And the diner itself was becoming something larger than walls and tables. It was becoming a home for the weary, a home for the broken, a home for those searching for warmth in a cold world. And in that gentle evening glow, all three of them stood on the threshold of something new, something steady, something worth fighting for. The sun climbed slowly over the Montana hills, casting long, pale beams across the diner roof. The building no longer looked like a forgotten shelter on the side of the road. Fresh boards reinforced the walls. New wiring hummed quietly behind patched panels. The porch rail shimmered with fresh varnish that still carried the faint scent of pine. Tom stepped outside, with Max at his side, and looked across the lot, where trucks and cars filled the space even at early morning. Men and women who had once passed him without a glance now raised their hands in greeting. A rancher named Lewis had brought lumber. A retired electrician named Paul had worked late into the night running new lines. A group of truckers had carried heavy beams into place. The entire town had poured energy into the diner, as if the building were a symbol of something they needed to protect. The work had spread from person to person with a speed Tom did not expect. When one neighbor arrived with a hammer, another followed with paint. When a driver stopped for soup, he returned the next day with tools. Emily watched from the doorway each night, her hands clenched to her chest, her eyes glistening as people lifted the diner into new life. Now, the final inspection day had arrived. The county car appeared at the far end of the highway in a trail of dust. The building inspector stepped out, carrying the same clipboard and wearing the same heavy coat, but this time his eyes shifted as he approached. He noticed the patched siding, the braces under the roofline, the sturdy beams visible through the window, the fresh shine of metal fixtures. He walked slowly around the property, tapping wood with a careful hand. Tom and Max followed him quietly. Emily stayed inside near the counter, gripping a cup with trembling fingers, but refusing to return to the safety of the ladder below. Today, she stood in the light. The inspector moved through the diner with long, deliberate steps. He examined the wiring. He measured the repaired wall. He studied the replaced supports. Finally, he lowered his clipboard and let out a long breath. "The work is solid," he said. "The building is safe. The notice will be cleared." Tom closed his eyes for a moment, letting the weight lift from his shoulders. Emily pressed her hands to her mouth as her breath caught. Max stepped forward and nudged the inspector gently. The man gave a faint smile and scratched the dog between the ears. The town had gathered outside, waiting for news. When the inspector stepped onto the porch and announced his decision, a wave of cheers rose into the morning air. Some people clapped. Some whistled. A few wiped their eyes. Tom stood among them, feeling the warmth surround him. The kind of warmth that reached a man who believed he'd already used up all his chances. By late afternoon, the diner prepared for something new. A night the townsfolk called coffee and letters of hope. Tables were moved. Lanterns were placed around the room to cast a soft golden glow. Fresh loaves of bread rested on trays. Pots of soup simmered quietly. A corner table held stacks of blank paper and envelopes for anyone who wished to write a message of encouragement for others. Emily stood near the kitchen doorway, smoothing her hair with a quiet breath. Her hands shook. Her steps were small. Yet she stayed in the open as people entered one by one. Max stayed at her side, grounding her with his steady presence. When evening settled over the plains, the diner filled with workers, teachers, truckers, and veterans. Their clothes still carried dust from long roads and long days. The low hum of conversation settled into the space like a familiar blanket. Tom stepped onto the small platform near the counter. He held a folded sheet of paper, worn soft from years of travel and weather. The room fell silent. Emily stood near the front, her eyes reflecting the lantern light. Tom began to read. He spoke of a time in the desert when he had nearly given in to despair, when loss had bent his spirit to breaking, when the world felt so heavy that he wondered if he could carry it another hour. Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out a letter. A simple letter written by someone he did not know. A letter that told him he was not alone. That darkness did not stay forever. That the human heart could endure more than it believed. As he read, the room softened. Men lowered their eyes. Women wiped their cheeks. Veterans stiffened their jaws, trying to steady old memories. Tom looked toward Emily and spoke her name. He said she had written the letter many years before. He said she had given him hope without knowing it. He said she had lived through her own shadows, but still managed to light a path for someone far away. Emily pressed her hand to her chest, her eyes filling. The townspeople turned toward her. Some nodded in understanding. Others simply stared with gentle awe. Max pressed against her leg, sensing her tremble as the weight of years lifted from her shoulders. One by one, people rose to speak. A trucker said her soup reminded him of home after years on the road. A ranch worker said the diner had become a place where he felt seen. A veteran said her letter sounded like the voice he wished he had heard during the hardest nights of deployment. Someone brought forward a long sheet of paper for signatures. People lined up to write their names, thanking the diner, thanking Tom, thanking Emily, thanking Max. The line stretched from the counter to the door. It was at that moment that Rick Dalton arrived. He stood outside the window in a crisp suit holding a folder of documents. His jaw was set. His eyes followed the line of people weaving through the diner. He saw rough hands covered in dust, truckers with rain-worn jackets, veterans standing shoulder to shoulder, children carrying envelopes filled with handwritten notes. He stepped inside, but the room hushed instantly. Every head turned. Even Max lowered his head and growled softly from deep in his chest. Rick looked at the signatures. looked at the lanterns flickering above the tables, looked at Emily standing in the warmth of the crowd instead of hiding below the floor, looked at the man and dog he had tried to push away from this land. He opened his folder as if preparing to speak. Then he saw the little boy from the storm step forward with his mother. They pressed their names onto the paper with shaky, grateful hands. Rick closed the folder again, his shoulders lowered, his confidence drained. Without a word, he turned away, walked through the door, and disappeared into the night. The room remained silent for a moment. Then someone let out a cheer. Soon the diner filled with applause, laughter, and tears. Emily leaned against the counter, breathing deeply as Max nudged her hand. Tom placed a gentle hand on her shoulder, grounding her with quiet pride. For the first time, the entire town stood together. For the first time, the diner felt unshakable. And for the first time, Emily felt not like a hidden shadow, but a piece of something bright. A place rebuilt by hands. A place protected by hearts. A place lifted by hope. Morning sunlight spread across the open plains like a quiet promise as Tom unlocked the front door of the diner. A new sign hung above the entrance. Max's Diner. The letters were carved from reclaimed wood and coated with warm varnish that glowed when touched by dawn. The name felt right, simple, honest, built from loyalty and years of shared struggle. It honored not only the dog, who never left Tom's side, but also the spirit that had carried them through every storm. Inside the diner, the morning lights flickered on one by one, revealing a space that no longer looked abandoned. Photographs framed in modest wood lined the walls. Veterans smiling with steaming cups of coffee. Truck drivers with weathered hands raised in peace. Children laughing as Max rested his chin on their knees. Above the counter hung a wide corkboard covered in letters sent from across the country. Letters of hope, written by strangers for strangers. They came from servicemen returning home, from widows learning to walk through grief, from workers chasing long roads, from people who simply wanted to say that kindness remained alive. Tom touched the edge of one letter as he passed. He read a single line he had memorized long ago. Hope grows in the places we care for. It reminded him of the journey that had brought him here. A journey marked by war dust sorrow, new beginnings, and the steady companionship of a dog who understood more than words. Emily stepped into the dining room with cautious, slow breaths. The light did not frighten her anymore. Her posture had grown steady. Her steps no longer trembled. Her eyes lifted to meet the morning, rather than hiding from it. She wore an apron tied gently at the waist and carried a small notebook filled with recipes. The pages had stains of flour and broth from the dishes she created. Soups that warmed the coldest days. Breads that filled the air with memory. Pies that reminded travelers of home. She greeted Tom with a quiet smile that held strength. He nodded back with the kind of pride he never had words for. Max walked between them with an easy confidence. His fur brushed against Emily's leg as he circled her once, then settled by her feet. Over the months, he had become more than a companion. He had become the emotional anchor for everyone who stepped into the diner. The town recognized this, and now he wore a small tag on his collar that marked him as a certified therapy dog. Drivers leaned down to stroke him. Children hugged him. Veterans rested their hands on his back as if grounding themselves in his presence. The bell above the door chimed as the first customers arrived. A pair of long-haul drivers with tired eyes. A ranch mother with two children who ran straight to the corner where a small shelf housed picture books. Emily prepared a pot of her signature soup, while Tom grilled breakfast plates. Max wandered from table to table, accepting gentle pats and offering quiet comfort. By midday, the diner was full. The counter seats were taken by older men sharing stories of their youth. The booths near the windows held teachers and repairmen enjoying warm bread. The small corner with the letters now drew frequent visitors. People stopped to read messages sent from faraway towns. Some pinned their own words on blank cards. Kind words, words of endurance, words that softened the hardest days. Tom stepped outside for fresh air between lunch and dinner. The sky stretched wide above him, filled with soft blue and drifting white clouds. He felt something in his chest settle. For years he had carried a sense of not belonging anywhere. Since returning from the war, he had moved from place to place, working jobs that left no mark on the world. But now, when he looked at the diner, he saw a home shaped from struggle and kindness, a place where people arrived tired and left lighter. Emily joined him at the doorway. She held a mug of tea between her hands and looked across the landscape. The wind brushed her hair back. She seemed calm in a way he had never seen before. She said she had slept peacefully the night before. She said she had dreamed not of darkness, but of sunlight over open fields. Tom listened quietly. It felt like listening to a new chapter of her life opening in real time. Max stepped onto the porch and sat between them. His gaze swept the empty road with alert gentleness. He seemed to sense the peace settling over the land. As evening approached, the diner filled again. Families arrived after school and work. A group of veterans gathered at their usual table near the back. A trucker, who had been away for months, returned and embraced Tom with gratitude. Emily read a story to two young children near the window. Her voice, though soft, flowed with confidence. The children leaned against her legs as Max rested at her feet. Close to sunset, the diner lights grew warmer. The golden glow traveled across the walls and the wide windows. It spilled onto the porch and across the gravel lot like a welcoming path. Tom turned the lantern hanging above the door and watched as it flickered into life, a small but steady flame. He felt Emily step beside him. She looked out at the quiet road, where the last rays of daylight painted the mountains in hues of amber and rose. Her breathing remained steady. Her shoulders relaxed. She whispered that she could watch sunsets now without fear. Max pressed against her leg, as if he agreed with her accomplishment. Tom placed his hand gently on the railing. A breeze passed, carrying the scent of pine and warm soup drifting from inside. The diner behind them buzzed with the soft, familiar sounds of a place filled with life. Conversations rose and fell. Laughter drifted through the open door. The clatter of dishes became a rhythm of home. As the sun dipped below the ridge, Tom, Emily, and Max stood together on the porch. The lantern above them cast long, glowing lines across the ground. It felt like a promise carved into the air, that no matter how difficult the world became, this place would remain a refuge, a space where kindness mattered, where a meal could soothe a tired heart, where a letter could lift a lonely soul, where a man, a woman, and a loyal dog could build something steady enough to carry them through the years. Max lifted his head toward the fading sky. His ears twitched. His tail brushed gently against the porch. Tom followed his gaze. Emily did too. The moment held a quiet truth. The world was still hard, still uncertain, still marked by storms and shadows. But within the warm light of Mac's Diner, there would always be room for hope. And as the lantern glowed through the night, they understood one simple thing: the light would never go out. In the quiet glow of Max's Diner, the long journey of Tom Emily, and Max reminds us that every life, no matter how battered by storms, can find its way back to warmth. Their story speaks of small acts of kindness that gather strength over time. It reveals how a single letter, a loyal dog, a shared meal, or a helping hand can reshape a weary heart. The world is often heavy, yet communities still rise for one another, and hope grows strongest in the places we choose to care for. Some call it chance, but many know it as a gentle touch from God, guiding lost souls toward healing and purpose. May this story remind you that miracles are not distant. They live in daily courage, in forgiveness, in generosity, and in the quiet grace that meets us when we need it most. If this message reached your heart, please share it so others may feel lifted. Leave a comment to tell your own story of hope. Subscribe to stay close to this circle of light. And may God bless you with peace, strength, and guidance wherever your journey leads.